So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. So while he sets up the computer, I can provide the introduction. So our next speaker is Michael Heap, an assistant professor of electrical and computer engineering at UC San Diego. Professor Heap is an IEEE RAS Distinguished Lecturer, a Hellman Fellow, and the director of the Advanced Robotics and Controls Lab. His research group works at the intersection of medical robotics, machine learning, and computer vision, with applications towards robotic surgery, physical human-robot interaction, autonomous driving, and search and rescue. Professor Heap's work has received numerous awards, including the 2016 Best Paper Award for IEEE Robotics and Automation Letter. He has a position as a researcher associate with Disney Research and as a visiting researcher with Amazon Robotics. Professor Heap received his PhD in bioengineering from Stanford University, his master in electrical engineering from the University of British Columbia, and his bachelor in mechatronics engineering from the University of Waterloo. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Heap.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about how deformable manipulation applies to surgical robots. Just a quick, general overview of what we do at San Diego, in UC San Diego. So in my lab, which is the Advanced Robotics and Controls Lab, we are looking at basically this cyclical four categories of going from perception to modeling to planning and control, especially in cases of challenging and deformable environments. And the thing that has drawn me to this area for many years, I've been working in this field for at least 15 years, is robotic surgery. And so if you haven't, if you're not very familiar with robotic surgery, this is actually a 10-year-old video, I think, of the Da Vinci robot that, there's many generations beyond this currently. But the idea is that you have a robot that can interact with soft tissue inside the person's body. And so we're interested in thinking about how we can automate these procedures just because of the fact that there's really going to be a doctor shortage. There actually is already a doctor shortage, specifically surgical shortage, that's leading to longer wait times for people getting important surgeries done. And so a lot of these maybe simpler tasks in surgery could be handed off to autonomous robot. For my presentation, I'm just going to do a quick warning. There are going to be some videos, we're talking about deformable materials, and I classify blood as well as a deformable material, so there will be bloody scenes, but it won't be too bad, hopefully. You won't see any external shots, just internal to the body. Now, and one more thing is why surgical robotics is interesting is because it's a very difficult environment to work in, and when it becomes difficult to work in an environment, it requires us to kind of think about strategies that are robust enough to work in these difficult environments. So it really helps constrain us to trying to solve the critical problems. So the critical problem we really found initially was that perception is an issue, right? So especially when you're working with deformable materials, and especially in the body, good perception is critical. And it's important for identification, localization, mapping, prediction, and certainly feedback control. Now, the problem in surgical robotics is that, unlike other areas, you generally don't have a prior model of what you're interacting with. So right when you enter into the body, everybody's anatomy is different, and there's interstitial tissues everywhere, and so everything you see is for the first time. And so that's going to be requiring you to construct it online. And immediately you're faced with this problem with a lot of algorithms that require pre-training or prior models that is expensive to compute offline don't really work. The other thing is that there's usually bad or limited depth measurements. We have cameras that are stereo cameras that have 8mm disparity between them, so their depth perception is terrible. So especially in depth, you have a very poor resolution. You have specular, reflection, blood, smoke, and there's always occlusions. So one thing that is important that often is overlooked is that your robot is covering up part of what you're observing. And especially in deformable materials, that covering up cannot normally be just associated with rigid translation. You have to consider some sort of elastic transition between what you can observe and what you can't observe. Deformables everywhere, and you also have partial views of the scene. You can't singulate an object in this kind of scene very well. So our first and actually continuing approach to this problem was something we called SUPER, which is the Surgical Perception Framework. It's basically a deformable SLAM method. And the idea not only applies to surgical scenarios, but it also applies to general robots working in deformable environments. The idea is that you first have to do 3D reconstruction of the scene. You have to find where your robot is in the scene. So that requires some sort of robot tracking. You have to delete the robot from the scene. And then from the occluded portions, you have to integrate multiple viewpoints as the robot's interacting so that the deformable environment gets stitched together over time. And while you're doing that, you have to do it online, and you have to not have the memory, explode on you. So I know this is a deformable workshop talk, so I will quickly breeze through how we do the robotic tracking, but it basically goes through key point detection on the robot and using those key points as an observation model that we tie into a kinematic model of the robot, and then we use that in a particle filter based way to get some nice tracking behavior out. And so I think just for proof that it works pretty well is that the bottom left and bottom right images is a robot hand that's moving at the same time the camera's moving. Okay, so we're doing both the camera and simultaneous camera and robot arm motions, and it's still not only tracking well on the left hand side, but you can see a CAD overlay lines up pretty well. Sometimes you can't even tell where the underlying robot is. And of course, this can be generalized to general robots like Baxter and other things. And depending on what kind of robot you have, you might not have a traditional robot like a Baxter. What if you could just input your CAD model of your robot and have it learn the features required to mask it out from the scene? And so we have this work called CTRNet that basically generalizes to any robot of which you have the robot mesh. And so it can learn features that can then figure out where the mesh of the robot, where is the silhouette of the robot in the scene, and that's using something called differentiable rendering. And it can use that to both do pose estimation for the robot, but also mask it out. And so we showed on a variety of robots here to show that it works pretty well. And I think that one of the final things that I'll talk about regarding rigid tracking is that we have needles and hands, and so that's important because the next thing we can do once we track the needles is that it gives us a good starting point on tracking flexible linear objects. So that would be suture thread. So suture thread is an interesting type of object to work with because it has some uniform properties, and so it's actually a lot stiffer than you might think it is. But one of the challenges is that it is very, very hard to detect in a scene. And so one of the realities of working in surgical environments is that you have a lot of complexity in the background. So we can't have nice uniform color mats and ropes on top to play with. So one of the things we have to do is now consider all of our estimates are of where our deformable object is an uncertain measurement. And this is going to be a start of a lot of thematic consistency between what we're doing in perception and uncertainty. So if we start at threads, we can consider that every thread is composed of multiple points along the thread, and all the points are approximate measurements of where that thread might be. And if you have a stereo system, for example, estimating those points, you can combine those two measurements, and with a camera projector model and an understanding of what the resolution and the potential noise of the model is, you can get this basically a reconstruction of a thread, but with an uncertainty metric. And what that makes it really useful for is now if you look at the uncertainty of the thread, which is shown in the orange, you can say, I want to grasp that thread, I'm going to grasp at the location where the uncertainty is minimized. That's going to help me improve the graph's consistency and improve the ability and the ability to complete an entire task. Now, I did mention fluid, and so fluid is, a very deformable object, and one of the things that we'll encounter in a live surgical scenario is bleeding. And so one of the things we can do is then use fluid modeling and tracking, and this is using some deep neural network to track optical flow of blood. And if we track where the optical flow is moving, and we actually apply a sparse map of particles that would consistently follow that flow, we would actually be able to get an idea of where that flow emanated from and where that flow will be going. And I'll talk a little bit about this later as well. So if we combine all these things together, we can now look purely at the problem of we have a partial scene of deformable backgrounds that we need to reconstruct. That the robot has been deleted from the image and we want to reconstruct it all together. And so the idea here was basically based off some seminal work back in, I think, 2014, which is called dynamic fusion and volume deform. And the idea is that you have a reconstruction of a deformable scene of which there is a sparse set of a graph that describes how adjacent particles in the scene should move with each other. And if you look at updating that graph online, you can then use that to stitch together and account for locations where you have occlusions. So if you look at these videos, they end up, you see the instrument is not being shown, but you can actually estimate what's happening behind the instruments. And we've extended this work to adding in semantic detection. So let's assume that we have multiple deformable objects in our scene. In our case, we know that there's multiple types of tissues, and so we're going to classify every object and start to impose a deformable model on each object and only use our optical flow and our methods of embedded deform graphs on each individual object so that they can be reconstructed independent, and they don't have this issue of if I tug on one, the other one isn't necessarily going to move with it. And Super PM is one where we were looking at using very large deformations or monitoring very large deformations and trying to make sure that we can account for that. All right, so these are very traditional techniques, and if you have been monitoring the computer vision space at all, neural rendering has become kind of the go-to thing for anything that involves reconstruction. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about neural rendering. And so the problem with neural rendering is that surgical automation and a lot of the scenarios that we deal with is that you're using untracked cameras, you're in a completely deforming scene, and you often have physical occlusions. And so we take the ideas from before where we can delete our robot from the scene, and but we can now use the partial views of the pixels that are remaining and start applying it to these neural renderers. In this case, we use NeRF. I know it's already out of fashion, and Gaussian splatting is a new thing, and maybe next year Gaussian splatting will be out of fashion. But what we can do is the concept remains the same. And the idea you can see is that in the original video, we can delete the instruments from the scene and ask the neural renderer to reconstruct the scene for us. And not only that, we can explore a moment in time, which is, I think, pretty cool. So we collected the videos of while it's deforming, and at certain deformation, we stop the time and we can explore the scene using changes in camera viewpoint. And there are people that are looking at ways to take this embedded encoding of the environment and doing kind of an end-to-end visual motor learning for manipulating these environments. We haven't approached that just yet because I think from our perspective, there's still a lack of understanding of how to account for uncertainty in the environment, and so we like the model-based approaches a little bit more for our application. So I spent half my time talking about perception, which is why I think it's a really important problem. But the other half is going to be about simulation, right? And so once you have the ability to reconstruct in at least the positions of a deformable scene over time, you might want to connect that to some physical simulation for a predictive analysis of what's going to happen. And so the idea is the real-to-sim kind of framework. So you have your hardware, you perceive something in that scenario, and then you immediately reconstruct that observation from that observation to simulation. And the first initial reconstruction will take a little bit more time, but every subsequent step is an update step. It's not a full reconstruction step. You can use any type of simulation platform. We like to use position-based dynamics, and the reason why is that PBDs are faster than real time. They are far more efficient than many FEM solvers, but also they inherently are tuned to be constraining the position of particles, which is exactly what you're getting from observations themselves, the position of those particles. So it's a nice one-to-one transfer. So if we do this, we take an observation and then we start manipulating the tissue. We know we're manipulating the tissue by tracking the robot instruments, right? And so we can forward simulate what the simulation will do. But the problem is that our simulation is never perfect because we had to initialize some sort of stiffness behavior for our volumes or our volumes or our meshes. So this mismatch really requires us to do online adaptation. And so there's two ways to kind of bridge this online sim-to-real gap. One is to learn a residual mapping, so just learning a delta function as you're moving around, which works really well if you're just trying to match up your current time frame. But the problem with residual mapping is that it deviates from reality when you're trying to predict in the future, because then it hasn't really learned it hasn't really learned anything that is fundamental to the tissue itself. It's just learned a position displacement. Now the other side is to do parameter estimation, where you're trying to back propagate all the errors you're seeing into the simulator and find the parameters of the simulator that should be changed to match what it sees. Now that often requires some offline pre-training, and it might be difficult to learn fine details. So fine details in the scene, localities in the scene that aren't mapped well, that can be challenging to learn. Or conversely, you might overfit and be prone to you might be prone to overfitting. So this was a work that we presented here at ICRA that was about combining both of them. And of course we used for our perception stack the super work from before. And so when we combine the idea of doing a residual learning, so we're learning that delta function while simultaneously doing simulator updates, we actually have them basically counteract each other, and the residual doesn't have to work as hard, and the simulation parameter updates end up being converging to more accurate simulations of the results. So our predictive estimators end up being far more accurate as we roll them forward in time. This is just an example of how this not only works for matching surfaces together, but also matching volumes. So if you have a surface observation and you have a cloth-like structure, then your gradients on the error between your observation and the cloth are in purple, and they'll just force your particles to move towards the observations. But if you have a volume, those gradients will propagate down deeper, and the blue arrow for volume, for particles in the volume that you don't see, will actually be pulled as well. And the nice thing about using the PBD framework was that if you define the constraints properly, the whole simulation is differentiable. And I know that there's another talk later on about differentiable simulator, but it's very useful because from a practical standpoint, to have a differentiable simulation, you can just basically hand it off to a standard optimizer, and you can use PyTorch, and it will just go from your observation errors all the way back through to updating which simulation parameters you should update. So what we get at the end of this is a nice match between our observations online with the overlay, and the thing that that you see on the right-hand side is that if you don't do online optimization, you get larger deviations, while with online optimization, your model better predicts the actual deformation of the tissue. And the parameter updates, like I said, using the PBD simulator happens at a sub-second level. We can also apply this idea to linear objects like ropes, and so from observations of tugging on the rope, we can learn through these differentiable simulators what the updated parameters of the rope should be very quickly. And so in this case, we initiated a rough idea of what we think the stiffness of the rope is, but then as it's tugging on it, it will be able to tell what the exact stiffness is. Right, and so the bottom is representing what maybe a vessel would look like as you're moving it around. There's a procedure called anastomosis where you take a severed vessel, so it's cut in the middle, and you try to stitch it back together. It's a very difficult procedure, but one of the things is that you have to tug around on the vessels to make them line up again. And finally, cloth is an interesting, of course, everybody is very interested in how to manage cloth, not only from like a fold and close perspective, but there's a lot of things in surgical robotics, not only tissues that behave like cloth, but meshes and implants. So when you have a hernia, one of the things that happens is they basically have to close this hole in your body, and the way that they close is that they have to manipulate a mesh and stitch the mesh to your abdominal tissue. And so there is a interesting, problem of autonomous cloth manipulation. One of the things we investigated here, which was another paper that was at ICRA, was how can we incorporate safety constraints in? And so the idea is that when we solve the problem of this trajectory optimization problem, we have both our objective of getting a cloth to a certain location to line up with a target, but we also have, and these are the terms that we use to define the trajectory and optimize the trajectory of it. But we also have the constraint that we want to impose. And so in this case, our constraint was that we didn't want our material to be touching anything else. And maybe there's a reason that it'll dirty the material and make it harder to use. Okay, and these constraints can be made differentiable by using the ReLU operator, as we know is traditionally very useful for deep neural networks in the back propagation pathway. And so if you use a ReLU operator to define a distance to collision, then you can incorporate this safety constraint, so everything is again differentiable, and you can solve this whole process using, I think we use the Adams optimizer with PyTorch. We can also introduce energy-based constraints. So an energy-based constraint would be something like we don't want to extend our cloth because that might tear it. And so by changing the energy functions, defining the elastic energy in the cloth, we can prevent that type of motion from happening. Here's a video of the trajectory optimization, where it's trying to control the path of the cloth through some obstacles. All right, coming back to the idea of fluids, one of the things to incorporate was going from the perception of fluid to the reconstruction of fluid. Again, particles, the PBD simulator is a great way to do that. PBDs were actually famously used in Frozen. I don't know if any of you have kids, but certainly I've watched Frozen more than enough times to start thinking about how they did the simulators for the ice and snow. But that's what they were used for, and a lot of the fluid simulation is actually, it's very easy to use that simulator to simulate fluid. So we're just interested in learning what is the behavior and like the viscosity and the connectivity of the fluid. And those are the parameters we learned in this example. And one thing that's interesting about this example is that we're learning from a monocular camera. Finally, when we put this all together, we can look at it from a surgical perspective. And our surgical perspective here was that we wanted to do autonomous blood suction. If you nick an artery, which happens more often than you would think in surgery, it will start bleeding, and the first thing to do is to suck up the blood and then figure out where the bleeding happens and stop it. And in this procedure, we can basically reconstruct the fluid, observe the flow of the fluid, and trace backwards the motion of fluid to find where the fluid started, and then we can run optimal control problem and solve for the optimal suction routine that will get us to sucking up all the blood in the least amount of time possible. All right, so what's next? One of the things that I've been struggling with, our group has been struggling with in deformable modeling and perception is that a lot of the time our objects are not free floating, or they're not able to be completely disentangled from the environment. We have to basically assume that they're fixed. For volumes, we assume that they're fixed to the ground. For objects and like ropes and things, we'll assume where that rope is attached. But the question is, can we move away from this hard coding? And if we can move away from this hard coding, then we can make these methods much more generalizable. So this is a work that is really very hot off the press. My student Nikhil, who's sitting in the back there, just told me that it was uploaded on arXiv an hour ago. Actually, it's uploaded yesterday, but it appeared on arXiv an hour ago. And this is called JIGGLE, Joint Interactive Guided Gaussian Likelihood Estimation. It was accepted in RSS 2024, so hopefully if you're going there, we'll talk a bit more about it. But the idea is that we want to learn where boundary conditions exist, whether an object is secured or not secured. And these boundaries are important in robotic surgery because these are boundaries where you might start tugging and you realize, wait, I'm going to violate some sort of safety as I'm tugging this because I might tear the tissue. Or alternatively, you might be tugging and you might think, actually, I want to separate this tissue from the environment, so this location is where I want to cut. Okay. Now, what we do is that we use hard discontinuities in stiffness to represent fixation. So the concept is that we assume that the resting state of the volume or the mesh is going to be, there's going to be a virtual particle that is coinciding with the current resting state of all the particles in this volume or mesh. And as you pull away from it, we're going to try to estimate the stiffness that is between this virtual particle and the actually translated particle. And if we start to try to estimate that stiffness and we find that it's way too high, then that's probably a likely scenario where it's actually really physically connected. So this type of continuous estimation can also be incorporated with uncertainty, and the map of which you're estimating the stiffness parameters can be used, you can use leverage Bayesian models for that, which is a very nice property because you're dealing with something that's very safety critical here. So this is the type of idea where we have a simulated mesh, we have attachment points, and as it's lifting, as we observe instrument lifting the environment, we can see the translational effects and observe where those hard discontinuities happen. So here's the example of a real video. You'll notice this is actually not a robotic video, but it's actually purely, my student pulling on the environment. And on the bottom left, you'll see the mean estimate of connectivity, which is thresholded by how much it thinks the stiffness is at a certain location, and also a variance of our estimate of what we think is attached or not attached. And that gives us a really good way to be safe about how we interact with deformable objects. And this variance actually gives us something even better, which is that we can now use this idea of uncertainty to do active exploration and maximize our understanding of what is connected and what is not connected
你看啥呀？你得跟大家说，你通过这看了啥了？
in the least amount of time. And we can do this while monitoring the energy of our system or any type of constraint, which might be a safety constraint. Finally, the thing that we can look at is cutting or fusion in real time. So as we are tugging on this system and we get an understanding of it, and a cutting action happens, well, that cutting action is a good prior as to something severed at this location. But it's not a perfect prior because we never believe that we have perfect tracking on our instruments, nor do we ever believe that our cut went through the entire object. So what we can do is that we can reduce the increase the variance on those locations where we thought a cut happened and re-estimate. And that will help us be safe still when we're looking at topological changes to deformable objects. So we can show this both in cutting, and this is an example of stitch transitions where on the left-hand side is when the cloth hasn't been sutured together, and then on the right-hand side is when a suturing action happens, which informs, if you look at the middle figure, that informs a potential connection point, but with high variance, and as you then do active re-estimation, it solidifies its estimate of where that connection happens. So the key takeaways, hopefully that you'll get away from my talk today, is that perception and modeling need to be considered together for deformable manipulation. And online real-time deformation estimation is an ongoing challenge, but it's possible. There's really strong reasons for online reconstruction because many situations involves scenarios where you don't really have the prior of what you're interacting with. Neural and differential rendering provide an opportunity to bridge that sim-to-real gap. And then if you have a model that you've learned, you can use really strong theory and techniques in model-based control. And learning nonlinear behaviors reduces assumptions that you might make about your scenario, so it making it possible to generalize to learning boundary conditions, fracture, or stitching. And finally, safety can be formalized and leveraged for these kind of applications. So none of this work is possible, of course, without a very dedicated group of staff, postdocs, and students in my lab. They have done incredible work over the past few years in this topic area. Thanks to them, my clinical collaborators, and the funding agencies, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, please. Go on to the microphones to ask questions.
Oh, thank you so much for that talk. It's amazing work. I'm very interested in this sort of application area of deformable modeling in agriculture. And one of the challenges you mentioned in your space in agriculture is occlusions, visual occlusions. You haven't really mentioned how you've addressed that in your talk. Have you explored visual occlusions and how these methods might be extended to handle occlusions?
Yeah, so I've addressed visual occlusions coming from your robot, of which you have a kinematic prior for, right? Because you're measuring your joint estimates from your robot. For things like agriculture, I think that we have thought a little bit about this, and so one of the things would be to understand the prior of a skeleton structure, right? It doesn't have to be a strong prior, but the fact that there is a prior that there's a branching event that happens. It's actually not very dissimilar from your lungs, which is why I like working in surgical robotics, because there's a similar to everything. But your lungs also branch out, very similar to a tree or shrubs. So by manipulating and interacting there, you can maybe expose intersections, and that can be what you use to basically reconstruct your skeleton. And that's what they do in surgical robotics. But ourselves, we haven't pursued that just yet.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the impressive talk. And my question is actually in how you evaluate the accuracy of the reconstructed tissue deformation in the surgery video. I mean, I think it's super difficult to get the ground truth of the deformation, especially in the occluded area. So how you do it?
Yeah, really good question. So you're right. There's very hard. There's almost no data that exists inside a person, and so all the data that we collected in our own lab. Actually, we have an operating room with my lab, but this was not. We weren't going to do this. It's very difficult to capture inside a body. So what we do is that we basically use the same system, the same pore cameras and stereo cameras, but we just do it on ex vivo tissue. So that's the best we can do at the moment.
Yeah, so even in the ex vivo case, I mean, like in the occluded area, how can you get some ground truth?
Oh, how to get the ground truth? That's a good question. So we haven't looked at the accuracy of the occluded areas. We've only estimated the accuracy in the non-occluded areas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your talk. I'm interested in the underestimation of the parameters, and I'm wondering, I mean, the next step then would be to do some planning for the automation of surgeries, for example, and how would the patient-specific simulation then help? So would the planning be only based on the simulation instead of the raw observations, or would you have like more different policies that can react to different clusters of patients maybe?
Yeah, so I think that it will come down to specific anatomy, like key anatomy. So I don't think that generalizable tissue, learning about like the general tissue should involve like priors from, let's say, CT scans or MRI scans, where you could get some idea of stiffness. But it's really the structures of key anatomy, like vessels that you don't want to cut through and hit, and those actually will be stiffer than the surrounding tissues, and also like tumors and things like that, and lesions. Those will be good priors to incorporate into your reconstruction and modeling. And if you have an approximate idea, that's a good point. Like, we haven't looked at this yet, but if you have an approximate idea of where they are, that could be another state parameter you were trying to estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thanks for the very interesting talk. I have a question about the nerve part. So it seems that just for rendering, you don't really need the differentiability of nerve, right? And for control, if you utilize that, I assume that you kind of needs like a target image of your rendering so that you can back-propagate to get control sequences to perform control, which is very hard to get in your space, in surgical. How do you see the differentiability to be used in the surgical space?
Yeah, so I agree with you that I think that the idea of these neural renderers have been very good for just reconstruction visually, how scenes look like, but they don't seem to be the right representation or they don't seem to be bringing too much benefit over more traditional techniques, which is why we focus a bit more on that. But I think that there is actually a lot of developments in providing sparser representations of these scenes. Again, Gaussian spotting has many nice properties about it, and it's faster to learn and so on and so forth, and it can be arguably learned online. I mean, like a minute is not online, yeah. It's okay. And as we kind of explore what the correct parameterization is for a neural renderer, we can make it more attached to maybe the downstream control task. And so that would be kind of my big response to where I think that's going. But again, admittedly, I think that it's such a new area that it will have a couple of developments ahead of it before it gets really leveraged for deformable manipulation.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's take again our speaker.
Thank you.